watching this. So yeah, today I just wanted to talk more about React components, React Lifecycle, what it looks like to actually work with these objects. Because you guys, I think it's useful to have already struggled a little bit with some React components, created some, before we talk about what it looks like when you're creating them, when you're working with them. So did people actually read through this chapter, or was it more of a gloss over? It was hard to understand. Was there too much going on? Not yet.
I was stuck on, I can delete my, every time I click on X for delete, anything happens. So
right.
I want to go to the next level. Okay.
We'll spend time getting you through that today for sure.
The one thing that was on the right there where you're at on the life cycle methods,
right?
A lot of those, I was, it's clear when they actually get invoked in terms of an actual component. But what I was wondering is like how realistic, like how often do you really use these in a real world scenario?
That's a good question. It depends a lot on what you're trying to do. So we've only used a tiny bit of this so far. Like we've only used like what, render, yeah. I think, and we really haven't used any of these other ones. And I honestly can't remember how much these other lifecycle methods we end up using. I don't think we do a ton with them, at least not early on. But it depends a lot on what you're trying to solve with your React components, and how much. If you're building something from scratch in straight React, maybe you don't have as much of that. But if you instead are integrating with existing apps in some way or integrating with other JavaScript libraries, you usually end up using these lifecycle bits a lot more. So what's going on with this lifecycle, what it's talking about is there's these sort of 3 different states of a React component. And these map sort of, but not directly, to objects. Like JavaScript objects. This mounting phase is a little bit like when you first create an object. So it's saying, okay, this component is first being created and being mounted into our document somewhere. We're rendering this at some point, someplace in our DOM or whatever. So if we go and look at, hold on. Got index.jsx, but that's not what I'm looking for here. Where is it? Oh, it might actually be hidden from us. Hold on. Here we go. I'll just look at it this way, which will be fine, even though there's, let's get rid of all this white space. What's going on there? Scripts don't matter that much. So when you're talking about the mounting portion of this, that's the idea of saying, where does this React component, when does this React component get rendered? So if we compare the, let's jump to index.js. Here we have a call to React DOM render. Let me zoom this whole thing. It works better. There we go. And this is sort of, this is your global hook for a React application. So we didn't talk a lot about this, but this is saying what I want to render is an app component. And we have the app component over here. and I want to render it in my browser, like the HTML, at the app, the HTML element with the ID of app. So that's just giving it this mount point. Where am I connected? How do I hook up React to my browser or my DOM in my browser, right? So it's sort of this this connection point between the HTML. So you've got your HTML, and I'm just gonna do, you've got a body, and you've got your div here, which has an ID of app. And then some content inside of it, but really there's nothing visible inside of there right now. And then you've got your whole React application over here, if you will, which is all just JavaScript in some way. And what this initial render bit is doing is saying this React application, a marker, that we're hooking up here. We're hooking it up so that the app React component is connected. So if you've got React and you've got some different components, one of them is app. That guy is connected to this portion of my browser. And what that means is whenever I need a render, whenever I want to do something and actually output it to the browser, I'm going to render that inside of this element in the browser. So change the body of this. So we can sort of show what this looks like a little bit. We can shut the doors if we want, if it's going to be distracting. We can show what this looks like a little bit by let's do this without React, just to show you how you're hooking into the DOM without it for a minute. So let's just start the app up. We'll open this window. Can't get it right now. This should work. Okay. Oh, this is weird. HTTPS should work. No? What's going on there? Oh. Hold on. I think I gave it a subpath. When I changed that so I could deploy it, it affected the way this works. So let me pull it up from here. All right, fine. So if we were to look at what's actually happened in our DOM here with this version of the application, we can see that here's this div app, and pretty much everything that we've done from React, it even sort of says here, data React root is being rendered inside of it. Treating this as its connection point to render something into the browser. And you don't have to use React to render stuff into a browser using a point like that. You could, get them here. Let's do this. I don't need this. You could hook to that very easily with a different approach. So let's say I just have, I'll say app equals document.getElementById app. So I'm not using React here at all. This is just JavaScript and the DOM. If I have a connection to this, that points to this app element inside of my browser. And now I could do something like app inner text equals hello world. What's happened is I've just said, okay, change what's inside of this element in my browser to just say hello world. And it's pretty much what React is doing as well with its lifecycle bit. When it's mounted and hooked up and you've got your app pointing to, or hold on, this saying render inside of the app component. It's just saying whenever you've created all of the content you want to write, just write it directly into that element in the browser each time. And that's what happens at this first stage with the mounting. So the first time that it creates your component and is going to write it into the browser somewhere, it fires off this lifecycle set of events. Component will mount, which is we're about to hook you up into the browser somewhere, and then render, which is okay, actually create what we're going to write to the browser, you know, process this stuff, run that render method, and then afterwards, okay, we've hooked you up to the browser. That's all these are saying. We're about to hook you up to the browser. If you want to do something before you get hooked up, output your content into it, and oh, you're hooked up. Now you might want to do something else. So you were asking about what you might do in these different points, why you would use the lifecycle hooks. Component did mount is useful if, say, you need to measure the size of your element inside of the browser after you've rendered, because you want to know how big it actually is. Oh, if this is too large, I need to take some sort of action, right? Do something else. That's when you might use something like component did mount, because until you've rendered in the browser, you don't know what your actual dimensions are. You can't measure that stuff. The only problem with that is that only fires the first time the component mounts. So once that component is in your browser, then anytime you change the properties or state, you're not going to remount your components. Instead, it's going to fire this component will receive props, should component update, component will update behavior, and then component did update. So if you need to measure dimensions like every time your component changes, you need to hook up to both component did mount to make sure you get it the first time, and component did update to make sure you can measure every time it changes. One thing I found really useful, and I can send this out, instead of trying to think about this on my own, this was a really great site that sort of walks through the process of component lifecycle. And you can even sort of click through it and see what's going on. So this is simulating the lifecycle of React component. So if you're confused about what's going on at different points in time, and we'll walk through a couple of these so you guys can get a feel for this. You can, when it instantiates it, the first thing it does is call the constructor. So we've written some stuff with a constructor, like our app, I think, has a constructor now, right? Where we're doing some work, we're setting some state and hooking up some methods. So that's the first thing that happens is the constructor. And in this constructor, it sets this dot state. So we can see that it sets some state, which looks just like what we're doing here, setting some state in our app, right? I'm gonna move this over here so they're adjacent. And then it returns, so it's done with the constructor. That means it's constructed your object at this point. So you've got your instance of your React component as an object that's now going to be used from this point forward with any changes that happen. That means that you're working with that exact same React object from now on, as opposed to creating a new one every time or something like that. It continues to work with that object. Then the next thing it's going to do, it fires this component will mount. This is that life cycle, right? So this is before it's connected to your actual browser. And maybe you need to take some actions here. Like in this case, you know, they're calling this dot set state. I don't know what they're changing, but well, let's change the state somewhat. So the next state is going to be component will mount, or the next state is going to be 2, right? And that's going to happen after it's finished running this function. It doesn't change that state immediately and change it. It's not going to exist until it actually finishes resolving that. So for example, if you called this dot set state somewhere and then immediately tried to read your state, it would still be the old value. And then here, this is about the only place you can change props, which is not really a optimal thing for you to be doing, and then you can return. So component will mount ran, or component will, yeah, after component will mount, will update, it says the props are going to be this. So now we've run through that, and now we're going to render, and you can see our state has changed. So now we render the components, and you can see right here what it said is can use the DOM. So after you've rendered, then you were hooked up to the DOM, and so now you're going to be able to perform DOM events on that. So then component did mount gets called. They're just calling this .set state so that you guys can see like this, it's changing the state each time. And this returns as well. And we're all done with our sort of initialization cycle. And the one thing you can see is they tried to change the props in all of these, or the props changed, I guess, at this point in time. But it didn't change our props during this cycle. It's saying after component will update, the props are going to be different. Because you can't change the props directly on your object. It's sort of something that's passed in and recreates them. It works separate from state. And that can be a little confusing. But that's the initialization cycle. You guys haven't had to work with that yet too much. But we have done a little bit with state updates where we're changing our state, right? That's this add note behavior right here, where we change our state when they add a note or when they delete a note. And that's being managed as well. And the life cycle for that, what's going on is, all right, we call set state. What set state does is it changes our state, or says our next state is going to be 2 here. So given that we've called that, we're going to call should component update. This is something you haven't had to worry about. And you don't need to unless you're trying to optimize your component. Because React is very smart. React will basically say, anytime you change the state or props on your component, it just automatically goes, oh, I need to re-render my components. Something has changed. But sometimes, like we were talking about the other day, maybe you don't want to always update when those change. Maybe there's certain props and states that you don't care because they don't change what's going to render in the render for some reason. Or you don't need it to update every time. You can update every 3rd time that something happens. And that's where should component update, this is a function you can hook into to say, don't actually update this time around. Your state changed, but don't actually re-render, don't update. If not specified, it returns true. I think it just ran all the way through all of that, or did it reset? Hold on. Oh, I hadn't clicked that yet. Okay. So should component update, if it returns false, then it's not actually going to update. So you can, oh wow, I haven't walked through all of this. I never clicked the return false. That means it actually didn't go down that path. It was like, oh, I didn't update. So you can see that cycle, right? If you're watching there. What happened is we changed the state. We went from, let me reset this and we'll watch it, because now I understand what it's doing. I couldn't quite follow that. So we're telling it to set the state. So the next state's going to be 2 or instead of 1. And then it calls should component update, and it passes in as arguments the next properties and the next state. Well, the next properties are the same as the current properties, so nothing changed there. But next state is 2. And if this is one that you can hook into to take some action, so you can change this behavior. If we return false from it, then what you can see is it doesn't go through any of the rendering life cycle below this. It just immediately goes back up to, okay, I'm ready to change something. The state changed. It is 2 now, but it didn't render our component with that state. And you could do that as many times as you wanted. Like if, okay, now the next state's going to be 3. Well, we told it don't render this state in our function that we hooked into, so we don't change it. But instead, let's say that we actually did want to change it. So we return true from should component update. Now by default, you don't have to implement this method on your object. It's already there and returns true all the time. It's always going to update when something changes. But like I said, you could have some extra logic around it. So if we do say to update state, now it's going to go through this whole state update life cycle. Oh, the component is about ready to update. Here's the next properties in the next state. Okay, update the state because we didn't do any extra manipulation at that point. Now we render our new state, and now we call, oh, we updated. So we're ready to, you know, move on because we did update as we were expecting. So yeah, I'm gonna send this out right now because I think this is a lot easier to get a feel for if you just click through it multiple times and start just walk through it again and again if you're confused, because it gives a really simple sort of click through process of getting a feel for these life cycles. So that was what happens when the state changes, right? If we go back to our book, these are all in this mounted section here. And if the state changed, it went through this life cycle. Should the component update, that was the point where we're able to hook in and change the behavior. Then it calls component will update, renders, and component did update. Now, if the props change, it's that same life cycle, but with one extra step. And that is, it calls component will receive props before it goes into this same life cycle that it ran for changing the state. And this component will receive props is another place where maybe you want to take some sort of action off of the new props. We can talk about potentials for why you would do something like this. They've got a little note here in just a second, but this is just an extra step of, oh, I want to do something when my properties are going to change. Like, here's my next properties, maybe something happens. So an example where you might do something on an action like that is, let's say you've got a component, and we could sketch something like this out. It would be a little complex for class, but let's say you have a component that renders, makes a request to another page and renders whatever that returns, right? Some data from some site or something. And one of the properties that you pass into that is, here's the information to go get, or here's the site I want to go get information from, or the data I want to get. This is working with like an API type thing. And so you might, when you say, oh, the component's going to receive new properties, that might be the earliest time where you're able to say, oh, go make a request to go get that data so that I'm going to do something with it once I've rendered. And I'll walk through a little bit more concrete example of that in a minute, because for a lot of you who haven't worked with like making API requests, might not make sense, but we can talk about it a little better. But yeah, then it's just that exact same life cycle here. I think the biggest thing to note about any of this life cycle, the one that's confusing that I was saying, is state doesn't change immediately. So React manages when your state changes. And we can see that I don't know why this link isn't working right now. Cannot get slash. I don't know what I did to break this. I'm gonna, oh, there we go. Right, that rendered finally. So if we go to our code that we've already had here, in terms of showing that the state doesn't update immediately, we can show that pretty easily. And what we'll do here, I think an easy place to show it is right here in this add note. So if inside of add note, we are already adding another note to our state, right? Let's check and see what the state is. Let's just log it. This dot state, and then let's log it after we've added the note. Or after we've called this dot set state with our new note. Oops. So if I pull up my console over here and we refresh this page, what we should see is there were 2 notes in my array for my state. And then immediately after I called set state, there's still only 2 notes in my state. So that's sort of what they're getting at when it's mentioned that your state isn't immediately changed. This doesn't change your state right then. You have to sort of wait until your state changes to know that it's changed. And how can I hook into that state changing and know that it's changed? Well, there's a couple different ways. One is you can pass a second parameter to set state that says, like, do this after the state has changed, and that can be a function. So if we wanted to do that, like, let me break this stuff out so that it'll read a little more cleanly again. I'm going to, man. So let me make this an object that I'm going to pass in. Or this isn't new note, this is actually my new state. And then I can pass in the second parameter, which is just a function. So I could say on state change. And let's write this using this newer syntax or whatever. And I think it passes in the state as a parameter when you give it this second function. I'm not 100% sure. We'll see. I might mess this up. Then we can log the new state at this point. We can pass that as our sort of second parameter to this. So let me see what happens here. I don't think it got that change. Or I called this wrong. This is where I have to go look at my functions and see what's going on. So what is set state? What's its definition? Well, this is how to update the state, but it has an optional callback argument. Let me see if I have an example with the callback. Did I miss it? Let's see if it's mentioned over here maybe. I don't know how that callback works. Let me see. It definitely didn't seem like it was calling it, or at least it's not logging what I expect. Or maybe there was a problem with my code. It says it compiled successfully. So let me try this .state and see if that'll work. So there we go. And that may look a little odd to you. I could add some more information here, but what we're seeing, we see 3 logs here. And what that is in our code is this first console log, where our state is still 2 items. And then it calls this .set state, but not until the state has changed does it call this function with the information or whatever. It doesn't actually call this function until the state has changed. So we defined our function here, but it's not being called yet. And so, all right, walking through the code, we define our function. We call this .set state, but the state hasn't changed yet. So then it logs our state again, which is why we see 2 and 2 here being logged, because the second console log in our function here gets called first. And we don't know when exactly the state has actually changed, which is why we passed in this callback, if you will, to say when the state has changed, call this function, and then we can do something. And I'm going to have a whole little session, and maybe Tuesday might be the best time early on to have a discussion around the idea of callback functions, because we haven't written a lot of them yet, and just introduce that idea so that you can get used to this idea of a function that gets called later just being sort of passed around. But that's showing you that you can't rely on set states to have changed the state immediately afterwards. You have to hook into it some different way. And then the last phase of sort of a component lifecycle for components are when you unmount them. And you probably don't need to worry about this at all. Components, cleaning up stuff when your component unmounts is something that you really need to worry about when you're hooking into some other code of some kind. So for example, in some of the stuff that I've done, we have a React component that instantiates a JavaScript text editor that's independent of that React component. And when we exit, we need that JavaScript, or when that component gets unmounted, we need that text editor to clean itself up as well. And it wouldn't know to do that by default because there's no hook between it and React. And that's where you can put some extra code, like component will unmount. That's where we can say, oh, editor.delete. You need to clean yourself up when this component's going away, so you don't leave code around, on the system or whatever. I honestly feel like everything I just talked about today was more confusing than clarifying. So I did not structure this the best. Yeah, I'm realizing that as I said it all. Sometimes that just happens. I don't know. Anybody, any questions on this sort of life cycle bits of React right now? Or how React components work at this higher level? So the other, yeah, we can go back and revisit that stuff again later, because I do feel like I didn't clarify it very well. The other items in this chapter, it talks about refs. And until you need them, that's not something I want to talk too much about either. That's another way to get a hook into what's going on with this component inside of the actual browser. So if you need to measure sizes or do something else like that, that's where you hook up to refs. And then it talks about some custom properties and methods and the different ways that they can work when you're doing a class instantiation of React components versus create class. We're not going to use create class syntax. That's been deprecated for React anyways. So we don't have to, anywhere where it talks about React.create class, you don't need to worry about that version of the syntax. Just worry about what it looks like when you're doing an actual class object of some kind. And this chapter talked about some conventions, but for the most part, that's not too important to know until you've written enough components to understand why the conventions have meaning. Why would you apply these conventions in one way or another? So yeah, every once in a while, you finish a class and you realize that didn't go as well as I would hope. I think that was today. I don't.
The armory example is good because it sort of puts it in slow motion.
See what's going on.
Every step, so.
Yeah, I think it's really useful to step through some of that to begin to get a feel for it. And then the other thing we could talk about one of these days that's tied to this is the way that React actually connects to your browser, which is a little bit interesting and unique, and how it knows what to update in your browser. So at some point, I think it'd be useful to go over that, but I don't think it's critical because one of the beautiful things about React is you get to be ignorant of this complex behavior going on behind the scenes, right? One of the beautiful things about working with these React components is we're not really maintaining, other than up here at this app level, we're not maintaining state. Like our notes doesn't have state, it's just a function that renders something. And the individual note doesn't have any actual state. It's just, again, a function that renders some content in some way. So it doesn't have to manage state, which means it doesn't have to worry about things like, oh, if this note was a new note and now it's deleted, it went from new to deleted, take some sort of action, right? This component just gets to say, oh, just get my information about my current state and don't worry about state transitions, just render off of the current data. And that's one of the beautiful things about React, and the way that it manages the complexity of a lot of that state transition behind the scenes, especially the way it hooks into the browser, is really cool. But the awesome part is React hides most of that from you, and so you get to act like every time you do something, you're just re-rendering your whole React application from the beginning. So there, any other, no questions, any questions on this chapter, or who got thoroughly confused by what I was trying to explain today? Yeah, yeah. I felt that. So I might try and think and see if I can figure out some other ways to describe some of this or some good examples to show you around some of this stuff, but I'm not going to try and shoehorn it in right now. So let's just check and see what people would rather do next, because there's still a good bit of time. Would you rather try and work through the custom color, like the color changer type stretch goal that Aris put out for us that we could work through as a class and see how that works? Would you rather sit down and do some hands-on with the different areas that you've had problems so far and are stuck? Or is there something else that you'd rather go over for any remaining time that we have? Any thoughts? Anyone on working on the custom color picker together? A few people. What about people who want some more hands-on help with something that they're stuck on? Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, I don't want to go forever on the custom color picker, but I saw enough support for that for now. So let's see what we can do. Why did my email start up? That was weird. So let's pull this stretch goal up and read through it together, right? Create a new button on your app with the label new colors. Every time the button is pressed, you should change all the notes on the app to be a random color. Sort of cool. All right, so, and this is us as a class working through this. How would people break this down? Where would you start with a problem like this? Like you're given, this seems like an actual valid type of programming task you might be given at your job. Somebody might ask you to do exactly this. It would be, oh, here's a story that we want. We want a button to be able to change the color of our items. So let's start breaking it down. How would you attack this? I mean, obviously I can give you a strategy, but I'd like to hear your guys' ideas or anyone's ideas. Start with the button? What do people think? Yeah? Would anyone else start differently? I mean, there's no right or wrong way to tackle this, I feel like. Yeah. All right. So do people want to start with the button? Okay. So how are we going to add a button to our application? Make a new component? All right. So oops. I guess let's create a new component. And what should we call this? What? Just button.jsx? All right. So we've got this new button component. Now I'm going to admit, here's where I'm going to get lazy. Watch this. Oh man, I don't remember how to do some of this stuff, at least initially. Let me steal some code from somewhere else. And no, I don't really want all this. I'm just going to delete it all, but let's have a starting point, right? All right, so we've got some sort of button. Now we could make it a class if we want as well. But this is a component. We're exporting default, which just means whatever this ends up being is going to be our button. If instead we decide to make it a React class, we can change it over to that. So now what are we going to do for our button? Next steps, we're trying to add this new colors button to our app. We've created a button component. How are we going to fill this button component out? Start with a div. We can do this as a div. Let me, hold on. Let me make this something that'll work a little bit here. Right syntax. So we could have a div if we want. Now here's something that I would do if I were you. I don't know. I would take a look at my app first and say, do I have any examples of buttons that I can already steal from? What? Right? The X here.
So at his point, that instead of props, it says task in the brackets and then comma on the leaf. Does that tell it when the person clicks the button? Like if you go to Node.jsx.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah, hold on. I changed my code. Right. So they wrote theirs in a little different way than I would have. So we'll, you mean this bit right here?
No, the part where it says our core default, it says task and the comma on the leaf.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's different syntax. We can do it different ways. So we could, I don't care about this. Don't say. So you're saying here instead of props? Yeah,
What's the difference between the way they did it and using props?
the only difference is the other syntax is a little more concise. It's shorter if you already know the stuff that you want. I write it out this way, at least for class right now, to try and be more clear. Like we're passing in this props object, and then we'll be able to pull off the individual properties later on. So if I was to write the same thing that they did, but a little more verbose, it ends up looking like this. Where what I'm doing is I'm just saying, oh, pass in the props object and then pull the onDelete property off and assign it into an onDelete variable. That's what's going on here as well. They also pulled off task, but so I grabbed the task. This is just a bit more verbose version of it, but I feel like it's a little clearer what you're doing. And then if you wanted to write this out to be even more explicit to somebody who's just learning this stuff, you could do something like onDelete equals props dot onDelete and var tasks equals props dot tasks or whatever. It's just different ways to write the same thing. And that other version is just more concise, a little shorter. Okay, so what's our next step here? We're sort of writing this out together. I don't know, we're creating our button component. We're creating what this is going to look like right now.
So can you go back to the stretch goal? Is the goal to use the button you currently have or make a button?
Create a new button on your app with the label new colors. So we've got a few buttons already on the app, right? We've got, this would be a button, and these are buttons. So our goal is to create a new button.
So then in div, I would start a button.
You put a button here. So you're saying you do something like, I'm going to be a little lazy here. If we jump up to this app, we've got a button, and this is an actual HTML element. This isn't a React component. So you put one of these guys, right? Something like this. And you'll see a lot of stuff that says, don't cut and paste code. You really shouldn't cut and paste real code, but I mean, if you're cutting and pasting just the syntax, I do that all the time too. But it can be better for you if you don't, to try and learn what you're doing. All right, so now let's say we have this state or whatever. Now what do we want to? How do we want to modify this? On click. All right. Well, let's do this right now first. Let's just get the button on there without it doing anything. So what's our next step for add our text? And what was that text again? All right. New colors, exclamation mark. Okay, so we've got a button component here. Add it to the app. Does that sound like the next step? Because we've got this, but we're not rendering our component anywhere. It's nowhere in our document, right, that we're actually rendering this button. So you want to put it up here in the app.jsx? I don't know. You guys tell me. Is this where you want it to go? You think? Mute you. Here, somewhere else? We can put it anywhere we want. I mean, we're just working through this together. You can put it up top, like up here. All right. So how are we going to bring our button in? Does anybody remember how to reference another ES6 module or file? Import. All right. I'm going to shrink some of this down so we can see the stuff we care about right now. Oh, we're already doing it here, so let's add another one of these, right? Import button from ./button.jsx, right? All right. Now, one challenge we'll have, because it's case sensitive, we're going to be okay, but this was important to import as an uppercase button because we already have an HTML element called button that's lowercase. So if we had imported it as a lowercase button, it would have created an issue there. All right, so we want to create an instance of our button and just put it here. And if we don't need to pass anything into it or add anything to its body, we can render it like this. Just put a slash at the end instead of having to put an empty element there. So let's see what happens here. Hey, we've got some sort of new colors button. That's awesome. So I feel like, you know, we're making progress here. And all right, it doesn't do anything, right? But this is part of one of the best things you can do when you're programming is to do the smallest thing you can do to see some progress and then build on top of it. If we tried to do all of the steps, including implementing what the button does at once, you may have introduced bugs in some different areas all at the same time. And now you're having a harder time because you have to debug a lot of stuff, right? Whereas if we had a bug with this and we haven't yet done any of the other work, it's much more focused. We're focused on, oh, just getting this on the page right now. That's the way, like, I try to tackle stuff when I'm doing it. You have a question or a comment?
Do the smallest thing possible. Once you see like that works,
take a break. Yeah, good job. I mean, literally, it sounds silly, but sometimes you do like if you want to feel good about programming, and you don't want to get frustrated. Do these tiny things, like do this, and then you can be like, yes, you know, I did that. That's on there. Like, I'm feeling good. Especially if it's something you haven't done before, don't try and tackle a big piece. Do a little tiny piece, and you can be like, boom, got it, right?
I'm gonna play Overwatch for an hour.
But just, you know, rejoice in doing the tiny little things rather than thinking you have to accomplish everything in one pass and achieve it, because you're gonna have bugs. Like if I write more than, you've probably heard me up here. If I write more than like 3 lines of code at one point in time, I'm like, there's a bug somewhere in here. I don't know what it is, but I wrote a bug. That's about the limit I can write and feel like I usually don't put a bug in. All right, so now we've got a button. This is great. Let's have it now take some action. So we already, how did we connect some sort of action to it before? On click. All right, so let's be super, again, let's just test that everything's working. Let's do this in a minimal fashion, right? So before we actually having it change the colors, let's just have it log something, like you click this button when it gets clicked. So how can we accomplish that now? Yeah, like log to the console. Console.log. So what we want here is we're going to tell it on click call the function that we've set here. So maybe we will, we could do this as an inline function. I'm going to put it up here just because it's a little more explicit. Var handle click equals this function. is going to get past the event information. And then we can take some sort of action in there, right? Like console.log. New color button clicked. So then we've got a handle click function up there, and we just want to say when onClick is called, really call the handle click method. So instead of calling it here, it might be something somebody would think about because, oh, it's a function. You're passing it a reference to this instead. Yeah. In the app, just a moment. We imported it, and that's so that it knows it exists and has a name to reference it by. And then we just put inside of our div just button, but the case is important. Is anybody else following along too? They are, but. All right, so let's see if this works now. I don't know. Let's try. Cool, I feel good. Something's happening when we click the button. All right. So now let's change what we're doing. So now what do we actually want to do? Every time the button is pressed, you should change all the notes on the app to be a random color. Now we're adding some complexity in. Okay.
Does that mean all the notes are the same new color, or all the notes are like different colors each?
They're all different colors. You can just you can bring up like the sample app and just run it on there. It's probably easier just to see it.
Hold on.
Where your end goal is.
You have
You got a link to it.
right here.
Yep. So every time you click on it, it'll change.
So that's cool. All right.
Well, we put the link.
What?
The link you just added.
Where do we put the? Oh, this link.
Yeah.
That's up there in Slack. So you can yeah, you can see it. How do you view pinned stuff? I can't remember. Anyways, oh, here. We can make it a pinned item if we want, but it's just a link to his GitHub account, because if you guys remember from one of the first classes we had in when we actually got this set up, is if you want your code to be up and live running where other people can access it and it's not running inside of Cloud9, you can do, after you've got stuff working, you can do this npm run build and then npm run deploy to deploy it to your GitHub account. Now there is one extra step you need to do. I think it mentions.
Okay, my point
But
is where we put it in .9, the code, while the color change.
the code for the color change?
Yeah.
I don't have it yet. Yeah. We don't have any color changing. I'm showing off his code
Oh, it's code. Okay.
instead of mine. Yeah, his code that already has it working. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't have it working yet. All right, so what we want to do is change all of the colors of everything when we click the button. I don't have a plan for this yet. What's our strategy for accomplishing this? To pick random colors? Yeah, potentially. We've got a problem right now, which is how is this button right here? How is the app, which is what decides to render the notes, right? How is this app going to know that the button was clicked so that it can re-render these notes with new colors? Because right now, the button is totally self-contained, right? Like this handle click is all inside of here. It's not communicating back to anything. So how are we going to tell our app How is this going to know that the button was clicked and something should happen? We already have an example in the code of how to do something like this.
Would you use the same one below it where it says on click?
Okay, so we'll pass in the handler instead of defining it inside of our button. So it'll be a property. All right, so now we're changing our button behavior a little bit, right?
Or where you try to do like the notes where it has.
Either way works, I think. But let's do this, right? We want this to act like this other button, so we can do a instead of our button defining its own on click inside of it, we're going to pass something into it, right? And in order to keep it minimal here, again, let's try and keep it as basic as we can so that we're testing one small change at a time. Let's just take this handle click that we had here, and let's take it out of here. And this is going to cause a problem right now. And let's move it up into this guy so that we're just passing handle click here. We're passing it into our button now as on click, right? As the on click property. And what we're passing is a reference to this. So now how are we going to change our button, this, to deal with this on click property instead of what we were doing before?
So are we doing this through state?
I haven't really decided yet. What I've decided though is in order for the rest of the application to know that the button was clicked, that the button handler needs to be passed, the on-click handler needs to be passed into it from this app level, because otherwise this wouldn't know anything about the button being clicked. It needs some way to know that the button was clicked. And in order for that to happen, it needs to tell it what to do when the button is clicked, as opposed to the button knowing about it all by himself.
Just like what's in JavaScript, like get elements by class and notes and then just change out the code.
You could do that, yeah. Yeah, you could do that. I'll say that's very anti-React and going to cause some problems in a React application in the long run, because React wants to sort of own the DOM of the area that it's rendering. So if you're changing it externally, then I might show you that in a minute, but what would happen then is if, say, if you click the add new note button again, and you added another note, React would go and re-render that whole section of the DOM, and it might blow away your other changes, because it doesn't know about other things changing that DOM. All it knows is I render it and change it. And so if something else is changing it without telling React that it changed that, then those might get overridden, right? So it's better to communicate it through React. But I could show you an example of what would happen there. And the React reconciler, this is getting into some deep stuff, might be smart enough to not break that. So we don't know what to do next. Are we stuck? Maybe we have an example in here already, like I said, of this. Well, we pass an on delete down into our notes, right?
So can you just copy that bottom like you were in the beginning instead of doing button in the middle to do the same line and just change it to match the items that you did on button.jsx?
What do you mean?
So like for example, take out on
Mm-hmm.
And then instead mimic the same notes line where you have, where it does that, where when you do handle like
You mean on this where it passes in this on delete?
it.
Well, I mean, it's not going to change what this button's doing by doing that, but because this is handling an on delete. The example that we have from this, because on click, on delete, these are all sort of handlers of some kind being passed in. The example we have from this is we can go into our notes now and see what it does with this on delete. How do we hook that up after we've passed that property in, right? So let's step in here and look at what we did. All right, so inside of our notes, we see, we grabbed the on delete property here, and then we passed it down, we set it as a property on our note. On delete equals on delete. So we're sort of passing it down to the thing that actually cares about it, right? Does that make sense? So if we were to use that as a model for our button, and what we're doing now is, can I do side-by-side rendering in here? Probably, that might be too small for me to actually see it. We're passing in on click now as a property, not on delete. And we still want to hook it up, but we want to hook it up like here. How can we go through that process? How can we hook that up? Not quite, because we're using some different names, but it can be very similar.
So move that function that you deleted from button and put it in that.
Yep, I did that. And we passed it down as this on-click property. So that means that props here has an on-click property in it, right? Because we pass that in. Anything that's on our component here gets passed in as a prop. So we can pull that off here. Again, this is just me being more verbose than them. On click equals props dot on click. That's me creating a local variable. I just called it on click. I'm going to call it something different so that we don't get confused here. I'll call it handle click, so it might be a little less confusing as we go through this. So now how do I hook that up? Actually, look, I already did. I cheated. I called it handle click like I had before. So I'm saying, oh, the actual HTML element, its on click event should call the handle click function. And the handle click function in this case is just being assigned to the props.onClick value that we passed in. Right? I could have called this onClick because it's just a local variable. And then I would have had to change this to say onClick. I just sometimes get concerned that it's a little confusing to say onClick equals onClick. So I gave it a different name for clarity's sake. Does that make sense? For the most part. So we've passed this property in. Let's check and see. I'm going to refresh this whole app. We click new colors. Awesome, it's logging our event, right? And since that doesn't exist in here anymore, it's only in app.jsx, that means it must be calling this function. So now we're calling a function that we passed in. So we're building this up. We're getting to the point where now the app can know about this, right? Except we have a function out here. Well, now we can just follow the same pattern we have for add note or delete note really quickly. So I'm going to just add another method onto my app. And what should we call it? What? I am, but what do we really what do we actually want to do when we click this button? We want to change color, right? So let's maybe call it change colors. And this is going to, it's going to get some event information, but do we care about the event information? Do we care where they clicked or any of that? We really just care that it was called, right? So I'm not going to even put the parameter here, this event object in, because I don't care about it. But we do want to do something when we change colors. Well, again, I'm a minimalist type person. Let's do the smallest change we can make, right? The smallest change I can make is just do this same console logging right now. I just moved it into here instead of where I had it before, because I'm moving this thing. And then a couple other changes we have to make. One of them is just a little bit annoying here. We have to bind. This probably won't matter, but this is a best practice. This dot change colors equals this dot change colors dot bind this. I'm going to ask you for now, don't care about why we're doing that. That's just a magic thing that you have to do for any methods that you add to your React objects that aren't already on them. It's a magic line you need to add to your constructor. Don't worry about why for the time being. And then we need to change what we're passing in here, right? So what are we passing in now instead of that handle click function? This dot change colors. Because now we're passing in a method on our app object. And where are we at? Let's try it out. Cool, new color button clicked. All right. So now we've got something here that's firing when the new color button is clicked. And what's the next step? What do we do next? All right, now we have to figure out. See, this is a place where I think it's really useful to separate out the way that you want to accomplish something from what you're trying to accomplish, right? So what's the thing we're trying to accomplish next? I would say we're at the point where we actually want to change the colors, right? That's what we want to accomplish next, right? And so when you're thinking about problems, there's sort of two sides to thinking about problems. You can think about what do I want to accomplish next? What's the smallest thing I want to accomplish? And then you can think about how do I accomplish that, right? And that's how you break problems down when you're working on them. Because if you immediately think about how do I do something next without identifying the very next thing you want to do, that's when you get into this state where you're building out a lot of stuff before you test it, as opposed to doing one small focused thing at a time. So I'd say the next thing we want to do is change the colors, right? And yeah, maybe we're going to do that with state somehow. I don't know. What strategy do people want to try and use? I could think of a lot of different ways to do it. I haven't looked at Paris's code to see how he did it. I don't know if we're even going down the same path that he took for this. You want to find all the nodes and just change them to red or whatever? We could do that. Yeah. Yeah. So we could definitely do that. Let me see here. We've got something that makes it a little harder. I'm going to add something here to make that easier real fast that won't change our application. What is this called? Why can't I think of the right term here? Class name, thank you, because I don't just want class. Class name is what I want. So let's call this a note. So I'm going to give it a class so that they're easier to grab. I'm going to do this real fast because it's not really probably the way we'll end up doing this. But we could do a change colors thing here where we could do documents.get element by class, I think. Elements, yep. And let's do notes. And then I could do what? I've got an array here. What do I want to do? What we get off of this? Something array like. See, this is where I probably wouldn't necessarily do it this way, so I don't know. Let's try something here. Instead of that, let's try a slightly different path. Let's say instead of automatically changing every note color right now, let's just how could every time for our notes, our notes here, how could we for each one of these notes give it a different color every time we render, even the first time, right? So all we want to do is give it sort of a random color of some kind, right? Each time we render it. So let's go to our little guide here, and it says, oh, here's how I can go get random, which of course I can't click on. I'm gonna be lazy. I'm gonna steal this because it should be really simple anyways. It's like a single line. This little bit of magic here. Oh my gosh. Don't even try and understand what this is. It's using a lot of really shortcutty. So this just returns a random value, a hex format. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is create a function. We'll call it get random color. Do I want it inside of notes or app? Well, that's a good question. If I put it inside of app, now I just jumped on this myself, right? If I put it inside of app, I could pass it maybe into notes, but I want to call this for each note I render, right? I want to call it. So I can't call it once up here because then all of them would have the same color. And I can't pass a value from calling it directly into notes. So I could define it up here in app and pass the function reference into notes instead of an invocation of the function. Or I can sort of define it here and have this maybe call it directly. I could even define it on this object. All right. So does that make sense? Why? I mean, there's not a right or wrong answer to that. There's just different approaches. So for each note, now we want it to have a color of some kind, right? So let's just say, oh, a note. Sure, it should take a, let me indent that. Note, let's pass in a color property to our note. Right? Why not? And the color is going to be, what do we want our color to be? We want it to just be the result of getting a random color. So this is a little dense again, and it's normally you wouldn't write it where you're invoking this directly here all the time. But since this is doing a notes.map and rendering each one of these individually, that's going to work. There's some gotchas that may, burn you if you try to do this in different scenarios, but I think it's going to work here. So all right, we've added a color property to our note. Let's sort of see what happens. Well, nothing. Why is that? Our note doesn't do anything with the color. All right, so let's do something with the color. Here's our whole note, right? But maybe we only want to apply it to the name, the text. So we could, but in this case, we're actually rendering an HTML element. So now that we've gotten all the way down to HTML, we have to actually properly apply that color to our element, right? So first off, let's get the color property off, right? Color equals props dot color. This is just me, so I don't have to write props dot farther down in the code. I can just write color, sort of shorthand. And now, how do this is where you may not know the answer to this. I don't know if it was noted up here, how to apply it. But yeah, this is where we can apply style directly on our element. And this gets a little confusing, the sort of double bracket syntax. And there's different ways we could do this. But what we're saying is style, the first one is saying this is JavaScript inlined in our JSX. And the next one's saying an object, a JavaScript object. We're used to seeing that. That's why you get that sort of double syntax. And then how do we change the color? I think it's just called color, right? And what is our color going to be? It's going to be our color variable here. So I think this is going to work. Let's see. This might not work.
This is where I got messed up with the double brackets.
The double brackets burn you every time to me. All right, so it looks like we've got some random colors, right? And if I refresh the whole page, they're different. Cool. People feeling good about this so far? This is good exercise, because I don't know what I'm doing. We're figuring this out together, right? So now we've got a button, but it's not actually changing our colors. But we do know that every time we render our notes, every time we render this, it's going to use random colors for our notes, right? So any ideas on what we can do in our change colors function here so that our colors will change?
Can we have a class into button here? I mean, what we just put in Node.js and apps Node.js, and we can just go into on click this and put it like a new class.
Like a new class?
Yeah. Like into put on click. Before on click we put style and blah blah blah.
Some sort of styling?
Yeah. But we have to input it to export it into button.
Oh, yeah. I'm not sure I follow exactly what you're saying, but I don't know if what you're saying would directly work, if I can understand it. Because the idea
Each time we click on
the button,
the
right? What we want to do is change our colors, right? Now, I've done something that's a little bit cheaty in my mind on this, and so we're going to do this in a little bit of a cheating fashion, right? Which is notes.jsx, every time it renders each note with a random color, right? So every time we re-render here, we're going to have different colors. And in our app, we've got a connection, a function that gets called when we click our new colors button. So maybe as a shorthand, we could just re-render our application which would cause the colors to change. Does that make sense? We're sort of cheating. We're not directly changing the colors. We just know that they change when we re-render. It's a little bit of a cheat. It's not as direct as what you might really want to write. I don't know. So I don't remember off the top of my head how I force a re-render. Let me check. Let's go look at the documentation. All right, here's a React component. What do we have? We've got some stuff that happens on mounting, not what I want. Stuff on updating, not what I want. Some unmounting, error handling, other APIs. Force update. Maybe that looks like, maybe it's what I'm looking for here. Calling force update will cause render to be called on the component. Skipping should component update. So that looks promising to me, maybe. So maybe here we say, all right, well, we're in our component, so if we just force update this guy. So we're force updating the app, which will re-render everything from the app on down, most likely. I hope this works, I don't know. And force it all the way down through. Let's see if this works. All right, so I'm gonna refresh the application. Let's see here. Cool, looks like it's working. People understand why that worked, essentially? When you say force update, it calls this render function again and re-renders. When this guy renders, that renders notes. And when notes renders, it renders this list of notes. And each time it renders a note, it gets a random color for the note. So we're sort of, I mean, it's a little cheaty, right? It's not direct. So one issue you might have with this code, if you really wrote it, is if somebody went into this change colors function and tried to understand how it was changing the colors, would they be able to understand that from inside of this function at all? Does this function in any way like communicate what it's doing or how it's changing that? No, it's sort of because you know about other components in the application that you're able to change the colors, right? You've got some knowledge outside of yourself that lets you cheat a little bit on this. And that can be dangerous when you're doing large scale programming. You don't want that sort of implicit knowledge of how something else works internally. You'd rather have it actually controlled here. Now, I think we've worked through enough. I think this is, you know, a good enough solution for now. But if anybody wants to take this as a starting point, the next question I would have, if anybody wants to build on it, is how could we instead have this be more explicit and not have it sort of executing some implicit action to change the colors that we, how could this actually maybe change the colors of our notes or something like that? And there's different ways to solve that problem. There's a lot of different ways to solve it. But that might be, you know, a next step if we wanted to go further with this. How could we make this more concrete so it's actually explicitly changing the colors of our notes? But I think this was enough for today. We worked through a good sort of hands-on, I didn't know how we were going to solve this. How close is it to what you did?
Yeah, you got it done. So I did branch in terms of your next step. In terms of the color for me, I actually saved it as a property in the notes object, and then carried it through to the actual rendering, and then it's actually like a property of the node object. You actually had like a color associated with it.
Right.
And then actually reference that in the node component itself. And, yeah, so same end result for sure, and just a little bit heavier because I actually store the physical color in my nodes object.
Right. Yeah, and that's where I would probably go in the end run. That's what you were trying to get to as well, I believe, talking about the set state. Because yeah, the idea there is like a notes would have an ID and a task and a color of some kind, and you would set the color here, and then when you click that change color button, it would go through all of your notes in your state, change the color on them, and update your state, which would cause React to do the re-render process. But that would be much more explicit. There you would be tied to, you know, the color concretely, and you would be able to understand what change color is actually doing because it's changing the color on your notes. So I think that would be, I mean, if people really want to dig into this more, that's a great next step for this type of assignment, would be try and put it as state on this and change it that way. Because that's very similar to what we're doing with changing our notes when we add one, but a little bit different, and might be a really good exercise because you don't have a book to copy and paste from. Are there any other questions right now? Go ahead and